Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inshallah, today we will talk about a new topic. But before that, I have a quick warming up question for you. When applying a learning, and that's a practice question, as you said. When applying a learning algorithm, some things are properties of the problem you are trying to solve, and some are up to you to choose as the machine learning programmer. Okay, so there are things that are properties of the problem itself, and there are things that you can control, you can choose, okay, as a machine learning programmer or designer. Which of the following are properties of the problem? So we take one by one and we talk about whether it is a property of the problem itself or that's something that you choose. The first one, data generating distribution. Data generating distribution. The way that data is generated is something that is a property of the problem itself or something that you as a programmer choose. We can choose? Really? The way that data is generated, we can choose it? Of course not. Of course not. Okay, so that's part of the problem. Okay, that's a property of the problem itself. Okay? Right. The second one, train, div, test, split. We choose, right? We choose. We can choose the percentages, we can choose the data itself randomly or whatever. So we control it, right? So that's not a property of the problem. The third one, the learning model. And here we mean learning algorithm, actually. By the way, sometimes we call learning model on the algorithm. So the learning algorithm, is that a property of the problem or something that we choose? We choose, right? Of course, as we are more experienced in the field, we can see that some of the models will be better for some types of problems, right? But still the problem doesn't imply or doesn't impose a specific learning model or algorithm for us. Right. The last one, the loss function. The loss function. Is that a property of the problem or something that we choose? Actually, it's a mix. Okay, the problem can affect the type of the loss function that we choose, but sometimes we have multiple ways of measuring the loss or the error. Okay, so it's a mix. You can say that it might be a property of the problem, and we can also choose. Okay, so it's different from the first three. Any question about that? Okay, so that was very quick. Now let's start the new topic, which is clustering. So in this session, inshallah, we'll go through a new algorithm, which is Kmeans clustering, and we'll also learn a new concept, which is unsupervised learning. What is clustering? That's the first question. Clustering is about grouping similar items or examples together into groups. Okay, so partitioning the examples into groups that have similar examples. So whatever examples that are similar in the data, we want to group it together in one group. Okay, and we want to do that over the entire data. So eventually we'll have multiple groups. So here's an example in front of you. This data has two features only, right? That's why we have the 2D space here. And you can see the colors here indicate the groups, okay, of the data. So we have here three groups, green, red, and blue. Okay, and each of these groups is called a cluster. So the group of data, of similar data, we call it a cluster. That's why the entire task is called clustering. Okay, so the idea here is that we want to find similarities between items or objects or examples so that the similar objects will be clustered together into a cluster. And we might have, of course, multiple clusters within our data. So that's the general idea of clustering. Okay? You see here what is the main difference between clustering and classification? In classification, we have labels. We have specific classes. Okay? Here, we don't have any labels. We don't have any classes. We just want to discover these clusters. We want to discover how the data is organized or how the data is structured. Yes?
Is the colors part of the state?
No. The colors here are just indicators of the clusters, but they don't have any label. Okay? We don't have three classes here. We just have three clusters out of the clustering. Yes?
Does the clustering generate labels? But it does not include labels at all?
Clustering naturally doesn't generate labels. But after clustering the data, you might look at the clusters and say, okay, this is because these objects have some specific property, so let me label this cluster. But that's something that you do, not the clustering algorithm itself.
But when we do it, it's still generating labels.
No, the algorithm itself doesn't say label this this cluster by that label.
Then how do
You can later look at the data and do it yourself. How it works, we will see. That's the whole lecture. Okay.
Isn't this a lot similar to KNN until this much?
Stay tuned. It is very, very close, very related to KNN. Okay. But also different. Here, I want you to see that some data are having different underlying structures. Okay, so some data might naturally be clustered already, or might have naturally some clusters, like the data that we have on the left. Okay, you can easily see that here we have two clusters of data, right? This is one and that's another. But other data might not have that structure, might not be suitable for clustering. Even if you do clustering, you might not get something that is useful. So not every data set is suitable for clustering or naturally have clusters. It might depend on the features also. Okay, you might represent the data in a feature space that doesn't tell you the structure of the data or the similarities between the data. Okay, so the selection of features, of course, is important. But at least with the features that we have in front of us, this one doesn't seem that there is specific structure, and here there is, of course. There was a question? Yes.
What is the difference between clustering and decision boundary?
No, decision boundary is just like a tool a visualization tool that show us different regions in the space. But clustering is a task. Okay? Classification is a task. Okay? Type. Why do we need clustering? Why? Why clustering is really useful? Clustering is usually used in a process called exploratory analysis. When you get the data and you want to make yourself familiar with it, you want to see how the data is organized, you do this as a pre-processing step. You do clustering to see how the data actually is structured or organized within your problem. So one very important objective is to automatically organizing the data. Instead of having the whole data at once, you start to cluster the different examples or objects. You want to understand the hidden structure of the data. These specific examples are similar in some aspect, so you want to learn something about that. And sometimes you do that, or most of the times actually, you do that because you want to do further processing. That's why it's called pre-processing. You want to get the cluster so that maybe you can do something for each cluster separately. For example, sometimes, and I think in the next slide you'll see that example. One example of clustering is to cluster customers based on what they purchased, their purchasing history. Why would I need to cluster customers? Maybe to target ads. Each cluster should be targeted by maybe a different ad. So we do clustering to first understand about the nature of our examples or customers, and then this is as a pre-processing step, and then we do something more useful with each cluster. Okay. So what can we cluster in practice? I gave you one example. There are many examples. We can cluster news articles, for example, by its genre. Political, health, sports, and so on. We can cluster protein sequences, okay, or genes, according to their expression profiles. We can structure users in social media based on what they write, their topics of interest, or maybe based on their friends, cluster them, and customers, as I said, and so many other examples. Okay? So this is the concept of clustering, why we need clustering, and what can we actually cluster in reality. Now, how we can do clustering, right? That's the main point. Let's first formalize the problem of clustering, the setup of the problem. What is the input and what's the output? The input is a set of points, x1 to xn, in the feature space. That's exactly like what we have in KNN, right? In KNN, we assume that we have examples, and each example is a point in a multi-dimensional space, or a feature vector. Okay, so we can think of it that way. So we have n points. These are the examples that we have in the data. Each one here is a feature vector. So let's say that we have 5 features. So this is 5-dimensional vector. Okay. So we have a value here, a value here, a value here, a value here, a value here. Okay, and so on for each one. So x2 is a vector, okay, and so on. Okay, what are the rows here? Each row here representing a feature, right, or a dimension in the space. Okay, so that's a feature, and each one here is an example or a point. So in our example, the previous example, each vector here or each column here is a customer. Okay, and the features may be the things that the products in the shopping in the supermarket. Okay, this is exactly the input data for KNN also, right? We assume that all the features are numeric and each example is represented as a vector. Right. We also have a distance measure. We need, because we said that we need to cluster the examples based on their similarity, right? Based on their distance. So we need a distance measure, and we talked about that in KNN, right? We mentioned that we have several distance measures that we can use. So the distance measure will allow us to compute the distance between any pairs of examples or points. Yes.
The example isn't it? يعني 1 point isn't a vector?
Yes.
But here you those features.
No, it's called the feature vector, right? That's a feature vector.
Oh.
This is called feature vector. Okay. Is that clear? This is exactly the same representation of KNN also, of the input data for KNN. Each value, each example or item, whatever we call it, in the data is represented as a feature vector. Each value here belongs to a specific feature. It's the value of that feature for that example. So all the feature values here must be numeric. Right, this is the input. In KNN, we had exactly the same thing except one more thing that is missing here. Labels, very good. Labels. In KNN, we have labels, right? Every example has its own label. So we had a label here in KNN, okay? And label for each example. And that's how actually we make predictions, right? because we get the neighborhood and make the predictions based on the neighborhood. Here, we don't have these labels at all. Okay? Right. The output in clustering is a partition. So we have subsets. You see here, that's a set S of the points. In the output is the clusters. Each one of these is a cluster, and it has a subset of the points. So S1 is a subset of S, S2 is a subset of S, and so on. So maybe S1 can be X3, X7, and X13. That's the first cluster. Here we assume that we have K clusters. Okay, so every cluster has a set of points that is a subset of the original points. That's the output that we want. We want to group all the points in the data that we have. Okay? Usually these groups are mutually exclusive, are disjoint. So one item belongs only to one cluster. But we can relax that. There are algorithms that actually relax that. But at least the algorithms that the only algorithm that we will discuss is doing that, is providing or producing at the end disjoint clusters. There is no overlap whatsoever with the clusters. Okay? Any questions so far? Is that clear? So there is a major difference between this setup and the classification setup, okay, which is the missing of the labels. We don't have any labels. Actually, we don't need them. Okay, we don't need them in clustering. We don't cluster based on the label. Otherwise, we will not do anything, right? We'll just put every example based on its label. But here we want to discover the similarities between the examples into clusters. Yes. That's what we will see. Yes, good question. But at least the concept is we want to group the similar examples together. And similarity will be represented by distance. If two examples are close to each other, then we assume that they are similar to each other and they should be in one cluster. Okay, but the details will be soon. Yes. Can you say it again? Okay. It's not that, it's not one thing that is done here. Okay, this problem is in general called recommendation problem. Okay, it has some similarity with clustering because the algorithm will cluster you with group of people, and those people liked something, so it recommends that thing to you. It's not just one step. Okay, it's more than that, but it has some flavor of clustering, of course. Yes, at one point.
We can use multiple algorithms
in one system.
Yeah.
Of course, nothing will prevent us. In general, to solve a problem, you don't have to solve it in one step. Okay, there might be a sequence of steps. Okay, that's a good question. But is that supervised? Can we call that supervised learning? Why not? Because we don't have a label. We don't have labels, right? It's not supervised. There's no one who tells us that this is the label or that's the class of that example. Okay, so this is called unsupervised learning. That's an example of unsupervised learning. So in unsupervised learning, we are not given any labels. There is no prediction. We are not predicting. Actually, we are just clustering the examples together, and the goal is to discover the clusters. Okay. Right. How do we do the clustering? How can we group documents by topic? How can we group customers by purchase patterns? As we said, we will put together the similar items in one cluster. The main idea here is that items in one cluster should be more similar to each other than items in other clusters. That's the main objective here, is to find a clustering that has this property, that within a cluster, the items within one cluster will be more similar to each other than the other items in the other clusters. And of course, we need to characterize what we mean by similarity. And in the example that we will discuss, which is Kmeans clustering, we use distance as a measure of inverse similarity, of course, right? Because things that are distant from each other are less similar. So we will use distance to indicate inverse of similarity. The example that we will, inshallah, study for clustering is called Kmeans clustering. So what is Kmeans clustering? I will show you the algorithm on an example. Okay? So let's say that we have this data. How many features we have here? We represent the data in the space, right? So how many features here in that space? Just two, right? It's two-dimensional, right? So here is one dimension for the first feature, and here is another dimension for the other feature, x and y, as you used to see. Okay, x is a feature and y is a feature. Right. The first step in K-means clustering is to first choose k. You have to determine k. So the algorithm doesn't determine k for you. So that means that it's like what? Hyperparameter. It's a kind of hyperparameter here. Okay, so let's assume for this example that k is 3. K is the number of clusters that we want eventually. So in this example, we want 3 clusters. So k is 3. The first step also, after choosing k, is to select k random centroids. What do we mean by centroids? This will be the center of the cluster. Okay, so we'll randomly pick 3 centers. That's just an initial step. Step 1. So in this example in front of you, you will see there is a red centroid here, green centroid here, and a blue centroid here. So these were chosen randomly in the beginning. Okay? With me? Right. The next step is to assign each point to its closest centroid. So for example, this point, which centroid is the closest to it? The red one, right? So we will assign this to the red centroid, to this centroid. How about this one? Green, right? So it will be assigned to the green centroid. And so on for every point. If we do that, we'll have something like this. The dotted lines here are not lines in reality, but it's just the assignment, that this one is assigned to this centroid, this one is assigned to this centroid, and so on. Okay? So this is now an assignment. This is now the initial clusters. Where are the clusters? We have 3 clusters now, right? The red cluster, the green cluster, and the blue cluster. Do you see them? Okay? These are the initial clusters. Now the next step is to recompute the centroids, because after assignment, after we do this assignment, now the centroid is no longer a centroid. Centroid means it's the center of the cluster, the mathematical center actually. So the centroid actually is computed by the average of the vectors. So because these are numeric, right? These are vectors. So we'll average all of them, we'll get the centroid. So the third step is to recalculate the centroids. So now, remember these were the centroids in the previous slide, right? The dark ones. The light ones are the new centroids now. How did we get these new centroids? Yes, that's the average of the ones that are assigned to that centroid, to the previous centroid. Okay, so all of these are belonging to the same cluster now. We get their center. And now this is the new centroid. Type. After we changed the centroid, that might change the assignment, right? So it's natural now to repeat these two last steps. We will reassign the points to the new centroids, and then the new assignment will make the centroids change. So we'll have to recompute the centroid, and so on. So up to here, we did one iteration only. Okay, forget about the very first step, which is the random centroids. The first iteration has two steps: assignment, and then recompute the centroid. This is iteration number 1. Then we repeat these two steps. Okay, so we repeat steps 2 and 3 until we see that there is no change in the centroids. When we have no change in the centroids, that means that the assignments will not change. Will never change after that, right? Because the assignments depend on the centroids. If we didn't change the centroids, the assignment to the clusters will not change. At that point, we stop.
No change in the centroid.
Yes. Which means not change in the assignment. You can do it both ways. Okay? At that point, we stop. So this is what we call K-means cluster. K because we have K clusters, means because the centroids. The centroids are means actually of each cluster. Okay? So we start initially by random centroids. We'll relax that later, inshallah. Then we see which point belong to which cluster, and then recompute the centroids, and then loop over that. Okay? Any question about the algorithm? I think it's very, very straightforward, right? And it has some similarity with KNN, right? Computing the distance, right? Where do we compute the distance here, by the way? No, when we calculate the centroids, we don't use any distances. It's just the mean of the points. In the assignment. Yes, in the assignment. Okay? So in the assignment, for each point, of course, we need to compute the distance between the point and the centroids only, not to other points, because we want to assign it to one of the centroids. Okay? Eventually, the points that are close to each other should be clustered together. But of course, there are some boundaries. Any questions about that? About how it works? Type. Let's see a visualization for that. I think will support your understanding. Okay, this is the link is in the slides. This is a visualization tool for K-means. We'll first pick the way that we want to initialize the centroids. We'll assume that it will be random for now. And then we'll pick the distribution of the data. Okay, just to the example that the data generating function. Here we will choose it, but just for visualization. Okay, so let's take one. Which one you would like? Smiley face. Okay, for some reason. Okay, smiley face. Of course, this is two-dimensional, so we have just two features, right? And we assume that each point here is one point in the data. And we want to cluster these. Okay? Type. Naturally, how many clusters we see here? How many clusters you would cluster this data in? 3? What are the 3? Eyes together? I would cluster each eye separately, and the mouth also separately, and then the face itself, or the head, okay, or the boundary. So it seems to me that 4 will be good, right? Right. Let's see if K-means will be able to get these 4 or not. Type. Now let's add centroids. We didn't have any centroids yet, right? The first step is to add random centroids. So we'll add centroid one by one. This is the first one. You see it? Type. Why is the area now red? Because if we'll do the assignment, every point in that space, actually it doesn't, it's not about the assignment. Every point in that space will belong to the red point, right? Because there is only one cluster. Every point belongs to the same cluster. Okay? Now let's add another one. You see now, all the points on the left region will belong to that centroid, right? Because that centroid will be closer to it than the red centroid. What is in between? Yeah, that's the decision boundary. Okay, that's the decision boundary here. Okay, type. Let's add a third one. Now you see we have another decision boundary here between green. So now this area is splitted, right? This area now, any point here will be closer to the green centroid than the other ones. And now the blue is very small. Are these the final clusters? No, these are just the initial setup, right? We didn't start Kmeans actually yet. Type. Should we add a fourth one? Hoping that we will get the four clusters that we want. Let's add a fourth one. Okay, so good that we had this one. Okay, so now we have this part assigned to the yellow point, the yellow centroid. Type. Let's now go and start the algorithm, right? What is the first step? Assignment of the points, okay? Assignment of the points. Now the points will be colored based on their assignment to the centroids. So all the points here are colored red because they are close to the dead centroid than the others. All points here are blue and so on. Okay, so these are the initial clusters. What's the next step? Update the centroids, right? You read it from here. Recompute or update the centroids. Now, because we have the clusters, these centroids are no longer the actual centroids of the cluster. So we will recompute. Now, notice when I click on update centroids, the centroids will move, will change. Okay? You see? This one was here, I think. Right? So change it here because now this is the mean between the red points. Okay? And now this is the mean between the green points. And now this is the mean between the yellow points. Okay? You see here now started some red points to appear in the blue area. Why is that? Because we didn't reassign yet. When we reassign, this will be fixed. We change the centroid, the assignment will change. When we change the assignment, the centroid will change. And so on until it converges. Converges means the centroids will not change and thus the assignment will not change. So the next point, the next step is to reassign the points. Now you see everything is aligned. Okay? Now we see the assignment, the new assignment of the points. This is now one iteration only. We should continue, right? So I will do the 2 steps. Every 2 steps we look where the centroids are now and whether they change it or not. So here we updated the centroids, they change it. Assignment, centroid again. Change it still. But started to make small changes, right? Still changing a bit, but seems like we are converging. Now, still changing, I think. Okay. Now I think we are done. Okay, the centroids are not changing, and thus the assignments are not changing. But look at the clusters. Are these the clusters that we wanted? No, right? These are different clusters. So sometimes K-means might not give you the optimal clusters. Okay? One factor is that is the initial centroids. As we will see inshallah in the next lecture, this is a major factor. If the initial centroids are bad, you will get bad clusters. Okay? And in other times, this is a limitation of how K-means actually is working. Okay? How the decision boundaries of K-means are constructed actually. Sometimes it will never give you the optimal clusters, but it might give you some useful clusters in other times, in other data. If you change this data and you have the link and you can play with that at home, you might find other data that will be much easier. This one is really not easy to get. Okay, other data sets might be easier to get optimal clusters. Any questions? Yes.
For this data, clustering cannot work, right? Because like the trace, there is no way.
Yes, it will be very hard. Yes, I think with K-means, I don't think it will be able to make it. But remember that K-means is just one clustering algorithm. Okay, there are others, of course. Yes.
We're choosing the number of centroids ourselves, right?
Good question. What do you think? For one run of K-means, of course, we need to know K. But next lecture, inshallah, we'll see how we can make a better choice of K.